Tasha's Hideous Laughter is one of the most powerful mill spells ever printed in the history of Modern, and is one of the key cards that the Modern Mill archetype uses to trample over the aggressive competition, pun intended. I want to use this video to discuss all aspects of Tasha's Hideous Laughter, and really go over the origins of the card, its current uses, and ultimately why it helps to cover the gaping hole in Modern Mill's game plan. And if you want to see more videos like this, then leave a like on the video down below, and comment also the card that you want to see me highlight next. Bonus points if it's a niche option, but I digress. Let's go through the card itself and read what it does. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is blue and 1 for a sorcery that says each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with a total mana value of 20 or more. A couple things to note is the relatively high cost for a card like this, blue and 1 for 3 CMC, and the speed at which you can cast this, only at sorcery speed, and the randomness that it works with. Not only are you working with the most random aspect of Magic the Gathering, the library when you're playing Mill, but you now have to contend with the CMC of cards in your opponent's deck. And to understand why these things are important, let's go over the namesake of the card, Tasha, and her origins in D&D, where she's probably one of the most powerful and notable witches in the game itself. The adopted daughter of the Baba Yaga,
There she is! Lunch!
and formerly known as Natasha the Dark, she's the maker of the spell Tasha's Hideous Laughter itself, which has been in the game of D&D since long before its current iteration of 5th edition. It's a first level spell, castable by a bard or a wizard, and when cast, a creature of your choice within range that you can see must make a wisdom save. On a failed save, they collapse in a form of laughter, falling prone and becoming incapacitated for the duration. They remake the save at the end of its turn or when it's damaged, and if the save is triggered by damage, they roll with advantage. Notably, a creature with intelligence score of 4 or less, Racto Scam, Tron players, sorry about that, but yes, with an intelligence score of 4 or less are unaffected. Thematically, the design being transported to Magic the Gathering has its holes, but is relatively flavorful, as it mills equal to 20 CMC, referring to a d20, and then the random nature of the cards you flip to hit 20 can reference the throws that the effective creature must make to overcome the spell. Where some planeswalkers across from us have a relatively high series of high CMC spells in their deck, and others will not, and you can imagine how this can be important against certain decks in the metagame as a quick out against their aggression. Historically, Mill has struggled against the aggressive decks in Modern, and has to take aggressive measures or extreme measures that, if you draw that one card that you have, such as Crypt Incursion against 5-color humans, then you can find your way out of a sticky situation, or else suffer the consequences of defeat. Now, Modern being a sideboard format is not anything new in terms of being able to build a 15-card sideboard against the cards that beat you the most, but having to take a loss on game 1 with no options against a deck like Burn can be a really tough pill to swallow. And it was an L that the Mill players had to take until Tasha laughed hideously in the face of adversity. Playing alongside the randomness of Mill with the inherent nature of the deck having to win through, as mentioned previously, the most random zone in the game, the library, Tasha's Hideous Laughter makes a value proposition, but at a hefty cost. The card is blue and 1, again being relatively high in a modern environment where whole graveyards are being reanimated at instant speed for the same cost. Tasha's looks to find an angle against those decks that go aggressive so that generally those will have lower CMCs and will be punished more. Take for example the Hardened Scales deck. As of the recording of this video, the deck is playing zero-cost cards like Hangerback Walker and Walking Ballista as playsets, and when you take into the fact that the lands are zero CMC as well, and nothing really ever over the cost of 2 CMC is played in the deck, Tasha's gets pretty lethal. Now, I will say that Mill players are generally very resourceful when it comes to finding their options, and a fellow Mill lover has made a great Python script, linked in the Mill Discord, which is also linked down below, to calculate the average hit rate of Tasha's. You can see how the output spreads of ranges to which Tasha's can mill on both ends of the extreme, and you'll notice that in this graph, the aggressive decks are generally at the higher end of the spectrum, including the aforementioned Hardened Scales being abnormally high. But this is simply a level 1 understanding of the card.
It's Morbin time.
As many of you astute viewers may notice, a large portion of the metagame is relatively low average in terms of the amount of cards that we can mill out. And it really might just be better to be playing Glimpse the Unthinkable or Fractured Sanity. So why not just play Tasha's in the sideboard? Why bother mainboarding it? And honestly, the two cards that I mentioned are probably just better off in a lot of ways. Many mill players are actually playing Tasha's in their sideboard. But it doesn't mean that we can't manipulate the numbers to our favor, change the graphs and change the averages so that we can then make Tasha's more powerful. And this is where that level 2 discussion turns into a conversation about surgical extraction. Now, surgical extraction is a 1 black card, well, 1 Phyrexian black, so technically free, for an instant that says choose target card in a graveyard other than a basic land. Search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name as that card and exile them. Then that player shuffles their deck. So this is a way that Mill is able to manipulate and interact with an opponent's deck and take away key cards. A card that is very important against fragile combo decks comes to now help Tasha's in a very important way. With the level 2 understanding of this deck, let's take a look at a new spread, a more selective spread here, where we can take a look at 3 decks: Green Tron, Amulet Titan, and Murktide Regent. Tron has a relatively high amount of high CMC spells, which makes sense with the deck's plan. And Amulet Titan has a large amount of lands, which is why its average is actually still relatively high, regardless of the high CMC spells it plays. And Murktide plays a lot of tempo spells, but ultimately the CMCs are still low, and Murktide Regent's CMC is really what's carrying the average, relatively down in that sense. But now let's look at this next graph, where we see the result of an imaginary surgical extraction affecting each one of these decks. In this example, Tron loses 4 copies of the One Ring, Amulet loses Primetime, and Murktide loses Murktide Regent. Notice the averages jump up? Take a look at the numbers down below. That's right, Tasha's Hideous Laughter synergizes with the interaction that already exists within the modern Mill deck. It fits like a glove, and it fits the game plan, which is what makes the card so powerful in all situations, even the game 1 situations where it feels like the Mill spell could just be better in another way. Thanks to the power of surgical extraction that honestly no other deck in Modern can take advantage of in the same way, Tasha's Hideous Laughter is able to affect the opponent in a more lethal extent, ultimately shifting the scales in the Modern Mill player's favor and giving the deck a surprise factor that no other deck has in any way. Even if a deck has 1 card at a really high converted mana cost, maybe Emrakul the Aeon's Torn with 15 total cost, as long as this card is the last card that mills, Tasha's can mill over 50 cards, and those 50 cards can add up to 19 total converted mana costs. And even if that 51st card milled is the Emrakul, it doesn't change anything about Tasha's. It's not like you don't mill the card. And that's what's beautiful about it. You can do these tricky things where the last card milled, the last 2 cards milled, can be really high CMC, but as long as the previous cards are relatively low, you're just going to keep going and going and going through your opponent's deck. On the note of Shuffle Titans, however, it's important to finally address the exile that Tasha's provides. An effect that can seem relatively counterintuitive as Mill takes advantage of cards like Drown in the Loch or Visions of Beyond, but it can be really interesting to note how powerful the exile can be in comparison. In a world where Endurance is a mainstay in any green deck, or Shuffle Titans being abundant, and then reanimation targets just being in everyone's graveyard, it can be more relevant to keep those cards exiled in favor of enabling your own counterspell, or Ancestral at home, if you will. Tasha's is a good card. It's a really good card, and has a lot of options with that. But recently, it's been a card with mixed results. Yes, absolutely, it tears up Hardened Scales and has been the only reason that the burn matchup is considered winnable, if at all, in recent years. But a card that's induced with so much randomness will ultimately ebb and flow in its usefulness. It'll be really powerful in certain metagames and not so much in others. And in a world where the top of the metagame is full of high-costed free spells, Mill will have to sit back and take its wins where they come. And it's not without them at all. Mill has won Modern challenges before, although relatively few and far in between, but it'll always also show up in the 5-0 deck dumps and have those matchups at the top of the metagame that it'll absolutely dumpster. And it will also be that boogeyman at your locals. And in the grand scheme of things, we'll laugh hideously as we relax and sit back and wait for the chaos of the Modern metagame to rotate in our ever favorite non-rotating format later this year with Modern Horizons 3, and in a time where we previously got Fractured Sanity and very closely so Tasha's Hideous Laughter, I can only wait and hope that we get another card that operates at a similar axis, filling another hole that the archetype has, ultimately helping to provide a complete picture of Modern Mill in the modern metagame.